Welcome back to Changemaker Q&A. Everyone, this is the show where we dive into all things social change related and answer your questions. Today, I'm going to be answering a bunch of different questions that I've been asked recently that I've just smooshed into an umbrella question, a kind of overarching question that addresses a lot of the questions or concerns that our audience has. And this is the question of whether Trump, or specifically the USA, is fascist. And why should we care as Australians, or as somebody, if you're watching this from any part of the world other than the USA? And this is a very interesting topic. Fascism, I think, as a phenomena, is not something that we fully understand. It has relatively recent origins compared to other social or political concepts. It originated in the early 20th century in Europe, and fascism typically refers to far-right, authoritarian or ultranationalist political ideologies. And it most famously emerged in Mussolini's Italy and then later in Hitler's Germany. At least speaking for myself, Nazi Germany is what I think of when I am trying to comprehend a benchmark for what fascism looks like. So fascism isn't confined to a single historical moment or period of time. It's more so a set of ideas or tendencies that we see reappearing in different socio-political contexts around the world. To help identify what fascist ideologies tend to present as, or manifest as, or emerge as in a society, there's a model that is often used. It was first put forward by Umberto Eco, an Italian philosopher and novelist. And he outlined 14 characteristics of what he termed eternal fascism. This framework is one that has been adapted and applied in different contexts in different ways throughout the last couple of decades. And so rather than thinking of it as a set of hard and fast rules or a criteria for fascism, I think it's just a useful framework to help us question and analyze the situation at hand. The question of whether the USA is fascist is a very provocative question, and we're going to look at these hallmarks of fascism that have been identified through these 14 core characteristics of fascism. And while the United States or any country around the world currently might not fully align with the historical examples that we think of when we think of fascism, like Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, there are a lot of characteristics that I think you'll see do appear or reappear in contemporary America. It suggests a drift towards at least what we would consider to be authoritarian tendencies. And this is an important shift not only for Americans, but I think for us as Australians, but also just in general globally, because of the intertwined nature of our political, economic, and cultural systems. The first of the 14 characteristics is this idea of a powerful populist nationalism or a cult of leadership. And we know from a lot of analyses that have already been done that Trump is definitely a populist leader, a populist figure. Fascism tends to center around what's portrayed as an infallible leader, somebody who can do no wrong, who embodies not only the nation's identity, but also their destiny, where they're heading towards. And it's often through populism that this leader seeks to unify people. The elevation of an infallible leader can create a very dangerous dynamic, I think, when it leads to dissent being silenced and critical thinking being replaced by blind allegiance. For social change makers like us, I think it's important to recognize that this can undermine a lot of the possibility for inclusivity and democratic participation, because these leaders' visions can become synonymous with the nation's identity. And this type of nationalism then tends to exclude a lot of marginalized groups. It tries to erase diversity or diverse perspectives, and it polarizes the society, which kind of makes it almost impossible to create spaces for equitable change or just critical dialogue on any issue. We saw this in Nazi Germany with Hitler's portrayal as Führer, father, which kind of elevated him almost in a messianic way. He was seen as like the Messiah, the person who was promising to restore the greatness of Germany. We then saw this in Mussolini, who propagated himself as this person who claimed to embody what was Italian national pride and these kind of imperial ambitions. And I think there are certain figures in US politics today that use this rhetoric around saving the nation, making America great again. And it's a way that kind of positions them as saying our nation is in this kind of inevitable decline if we continue the way that they are. I'm not here to argue that the nation's not in a decline, but it's this idea that this person can foster like a cult personality as an infallible authority figure and kind of deny that they have any wrongdoing and say that they are the one who is going to lift the people out of this mess. The second characteristic is political power from myth, rage, or lies. Fascist regimes thrive on propaganda, and they reject a lot of empirical evidence in terms of reality. When political power is derived from these myths or these fables or these falsehoods, it corrodes public trust and distorts reality. And as changemakers, this can make it very difficult for us to do our work because it's hard to build movements based on evidence and reason when people are blind to evidence and reason and they're only willing to buy into these kind of grander false narratives that, you know, are so deeply ingrained in their worldview. Propaganda not only manipulates people's emotions, but it undermines, I think, solidarity and collective action. And this creates an environment that kind of fosters not the good type of skepticism that we would want to see towards certain claims being made by different institutions, but almost a suspicion that leads to division and an inability to just agree with basic truths, science, reason that is needed to address the systemic problems that our world is facing. There was a lot of propaganda under the Nazi regime in terms of this myth of an Aryan race and the supremacy of the Aryan race or Aryan people. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories perpetuated towards Jews. In the USSR, while it was communist, first and foremost, more so than fascist, there were a lot of traits that we could see that are aligned with fascism. This idea of fabricating political myths to sustain authoritarian rule, and there was often people who were accused of sabotage, or anybody who didn't align with their agenda was seen as somebody who was sabotaging the success of the USSR. And in today, I think we see a lot of narratives denying things like the election and the results of the election, the kind of spreading of these conspiracy theories that challenge the legitimacy of democratic institutions. And I think it's most worrying when there's almost not even a denial of the legitimacy of these institutions, but I think the way Trump treats them is like they're a joke, like they mean nothing. He's made jokes at his inauguration speech about how he's been the most sought after in terms of all of the charges against him, and he almost makes a mockery of these institutions, which I think is very worrying. The third characteristic is a fixation on this idea of national decline or victimhood. Fascists will exploit these narratives of humiliation in order to justify their rise. Framing a nation in decline creates this sense of fear and urgency. And fascists really exploit this to justify their policies. For changemakers, this narrative can pose, I think, a really significant barrier because it shifts the public focus from the systemic issues that are causing this decline to these exaggerated narratives about external threats. It fuels resentment and scapegoating, and it prevents a lot of constructive solutions moving forward in terms of addressing inequality, injustice, or environmental degradation. In Nazi Germany, the Treaty of Versailles was framed as this national humiliation, which stoked a lot of resentment and calls for vengeance. In post-World War I Italy under Mussolini, there was this portrayal of Italy's failure to secure promised territories as almost like a betrayal to the people. And there's this narrative in the US today that is being weakened by these external forces like immigration or globalization. And this kind of fuels this sentiment around, yes, we are the victims of these things and we must protect ourselves because our nation will fall further into decline. Then there is replacement theory and this idea of an opposition to harmony. There are a lot of ideals that are central to democracy, like equality, that are reframed as threats to the dominant group. And these are done in a way where the less dominant group still buy into them. The promotion of replacement theory and rejection of harmony kind of undermines any efforts that we have to build inclusive societies. For changemakers, these ideologies are going to delegitimize the importance of diversity, and it's going to sow mistrust amongst communities and erode social cohesion. By framing equality and multiculturalism as threats rather than good things, fascism tends to then pit groups against one another, and it dismantles the foundations that have been built on mutual understanding or collective progress. We saw this in Nazi Germany with the Nuremberg laws institutionalizing racial purity and restricting the rights of Jews and other minorities. We saw this in apartheid South Africa, where laws were created to maintain white dominance over black populations. And we see replacement theory rhetoric in the USA today targeting immigrants, often casting them as threats to the cultural and political fabric of the US. The fifth characteristic is a disdain for human rights, and fascism's contempt for human rights kind of strips individuals of their dignity, and it legitimizes a lot of violence against marginalized communities. For changemakers, this is almost a direct assault on any efforts to protect and expand human rights for everyone. It normalizes discrimination and exclusion, and it makes it a lot harder for us to advocate for policies to prioritize equity, social justice, and it creates environments of fear that really suppress any activism or resistance to injustice. We saw this in Nazi Germany. Obviously, the Holocaust represents the ultimate disdain for human rights with the systemic genocide of Jews and other groups. We saw Japanese imperialism during World War II involving a lot of atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, which was framed as a cleansing of inferior groups. And in the USA today, there are a lot of policy proposals that aim to restrict people's rights based on race, religion, immigration, sex, and this kind of mirrors the disdain that they have. The sixth characteristic is scapegoating enemies. Scapegoating enemies unifies supporters and almost gives them a reason to justify violence or repression. Scapegoating unifies people through hatred rather than hope. It diverts attention from any systemic problems that are going to prevent meaningful change. And for changemakers, the identification of enemies within society is going to be a major obstacle. It shifts the blame onto often vulnerable groups, and it absolves those in power of any real responsibility to address the root causes of inequality and injustice. In Nazi Germany, Jews, communists, and other groups were positioned as the scapegoats for Germany's economic struggles and social challenges. McCarthyism in the USA demonized alleged communists, and it led to blacklisting and imprisonment of a lot of vulnerable people. And in the USA today, there is a lot of political discourse that blames specific groups like immigrants or certain religious communities for their societal problems. The seventh characteristic is the supremacy of the military. Militarism and the glorification of violence are hallmarks of fascist states. Glorify violence as a tool for control and redemption. It creates a climate where fear and aggression dominate, and this is particularly dangerous for changemakers that are advocating for peace and non-violence and systemic reform. Militarism prioritizes power and control over any kind of useful dialogue or conflict resolution. And there's no room for empathy. It shrinks civic spaces and it makes any kind of grassroots mobilization very risky in a lot of situations, if not impossible. We saw this in Nazi Germany, where there was both domestic control and territorial expansion. We saw this in Franco's Spain, which relied on military power to maintain its authoritarian rule. And in the US today, there are excessive military budgets and a lot of rhetoric glorifying armed intervention that echoes these fascist tendencies. The eighth characteristic, rampant sexism. Fascist regimes often reinforce the patriarchal structures in which they emerge. And fascism enforces really rigid gender roles, and it can suppress the rights of women or gender diverse individuals, further perpetuating any systemic oppression. For changemakers, this stifles any movements for gender equity and justice. It frames progressive efforts as threats to traditional values, and the exclusion of women and minorities from public life can limit the diversity of voices that's really necessary for meaningful social change. In Nazi Germany, women were relegated to roles as mothers and homemakers, and they were celebrated through policies like the Cross of Honor of the German Mother. This is not to say that women and women's work and domestic work shouldn't be valued, but it shouldn't be the work that women are reduced to and forced to undertake. Under Mussolini, Italian women were encouraged to bear children for the state, and they were excluded from public life. In the USA today, there are a lot of debates around women's reproductive rights, obviously the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and there's a lot of discussion about gender roles that kind of reflect the ongoing struggles women have against institutionalized sexism. Characteristic number 9 is the control of mass media. Fascist regimes suppress dissent through controlling media narratives, and when mass media is controlled or discredited, fascist regimes tend to monopolize narratives and suppress any dissenting views. For changemakers, this creates significant challenges because the ability for us to share alternative perspectives, to mobilize communities, to challenge oppressive systems rely on free and open communication. The erosion of truth fosters apathy and confusion, and it weakens collective action. In Nazi Germany, the Nazi Party monopolized the press. They ensured that only state-approved messages were disseminated. In Pinochet's Chile, there was censored media and targeted attacks on dissenting journalists. In the USA today, there are a lot of disinformation campaigns and allegations of media bias that are intentionally perpetuated to create an environment where the truth is contested. The 10th characteristic is an obsession with national security. Fostering paranoia about security and crime really enables fascists to justify authoritarian measures and suppress any opposition. For changemakers, this creates an even more hostile environment where our activism is going to be framed as subversive or dangerous. There's a focus on enemies within, which kind of diverts attention from systemic issues like poverty, inequality, or environmental crises. And this is critical to long-term societal well-being. We saw this in Nazi Germany, where the Reichstag fire was used to frame communists as an existential threat, justifying crackdowns on people who were perceived to be communists. The Red Scare in the USA fostered a lot of paranoia about communism infiltrating society, and in the USA today, policies focusing on law and order often exaggerate threats to national security, particularly from minority groups. Our 11th characteristic is religion and government becoming intertwined. Fascism often uses religion to legitimize its authority. Fascism's intertwining of religion and the state enables fascists to weaponize faith to legitimize their oppression and exclusion. This is very dangerous for us as changemakers. It undermines any kind of secular governments or faith that we have in a secular state. And it also undermines pluralism. It makes it harder for us to advocate for any policies that can respect diverse beliefs. The use of religion as a political tool often silences dissent by framing opposition as immoral. In Nazi Germany, the regime co-opted Christian symbols and sought to create a positive Christianity aligned with Nazi ideology. In Franco's Spain, it intertwined Catholicism with authoritarian rule. And in the USA today, a lot of political movements are invoking Christian religious rhetoric to justify policy decisions to align with. Our 12th characteristic is the protection of corporate power. Fascism prioritizes corporate interests while suppressing labor movements. Fascist regimes will prioritize corporate interests over workers' rights to create economic systems that benefit the elite at the expense of the majority. For changemakers, this obviously undermines any efforts that we've made to build fair and sustainable economies. By dismantling unions and silencing worker advocacy, fascism prevents collective bargaining and it amplifies any income inequality and further perpetuates cycles of inequality and poverty. In Nazi Germany, we saw industrialists like Krupp and Simons collaborate with the regime, benefiting from forced labor. In Mussolini's Italy, they dismantled unions and they enforced corporate-state collaboration. And in the USA today, there is a lot of union busting and corporate influence over policy that illustrates some pretty concerning parallels. The 13th characteristic is a disdain for intellectuals. Fascist regimes will marginalize dissenting voices in academia and the arts. Fascism's hostility towards intellectuals or the arts stifles creativity, critical thinking, and innovation, which are essential for transformative change. For changemakers, this presents a significant threat because it marginalizes voices that challenge the status quo and it limits access to new ideas. The suppression of critical discourse also weakens the capacity to envision alternative futures. In Nazi Germany, books by Jewish authors or leftist authors were burnt as part of a cultural cleansing. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia targeted a lot of intellectuals during its rule. And in the USA today, there are efforts to limit a whole bunch of academic discourse or disciplines. Things like critical race theory seems to come under fire a lot. And we see a lot of banning of books in schools and things like that. Characteristic 14 is cronyism and corruption. Loyalty to the leader supersedes any competence. The prioritization of loyalty over competence creates inefficiency, corruption, and systemic riot. For changemakers, this completely undermines any trust people have in institutions, and it makes it really difficult to engage with government structures to enact change. It diverts resources away from public welfare and reinforcing inequality and reducing opportunities for collaborative problem solving. In Nazi Germany, positions of power were often awarded based on loyalty to Hitler rather than expertise. In Marcos, Philippines, this was marked by nepotism and corruption. And today in the USA, there are a lot of instances of political appointments based on loyalty rather than qualifications. Or, as we've seen recently, the appointment of people who have done really questionable things and been convicted of very questionable things being elected. These characteristics are not exclusive to fascism, but they do highlight the dangers of authoritarianism. And understanding these patterns can really help us to identify and resist the resurgence of these ideologies in contemporary societies. I've spoken about why this matters to changemakers throughout this episode. Why should this matter to Australians in particular? The US is still perceived as one of Australia's closest allies, and the United States still significantly influences our foreign policies, our economic decisions, and a lot of our cultural norms. I think beyond the kind of higher level policy implications and the relationship between the two nation states, I think this trickles down through the interactions that we have as individuals, particularly in spaces like online spaces like TikTok. I think that the TikTokification of social media has forced a lot of us to engage with more US-based thinkers and creators and people than any other social media platform has previously. I can at least speak for myself when I say that I have never followed or listened to as many people from the USA as I do now that TikTok is a thing. And we have to realize that influences our way of thinking. It influences the way that we perceive the world. It influences the way we interact with other people. So I think that it matters at both a national level, but it also matters, I think, for us just at an individual grassroots level. America's drift away from democratic ideals. It destabilizes the global balance of power. If the United States becomes less committed to human rights, multilateralism, and even just respect for international law and the rule of law, this can really embolden authoritarian regimes worldwide. And for Australia, we rely on a stable global order to safeguard a lot of our interests. So this can pose significant challenges for us. Australia is not immune to the rise of populist nationalism. I think this is evidenced by a lot of movements that we see opposing multiculturalism and championing a lot of exclusionary rhetoric. Observing America's political trajectory offers us a bit of a warning. It's almost like holding a mirror up and saying this could be us if we don't check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. We need to recognize these risks and actually do something to protect our institutions, our political institutions, and our social fabric. It's one thing for us to look at America and laugh at them and make jokes about all of the ridiculous things that Trump does. But it's another thing to stop and recognize that if we're not careful, this could be our future, which is very scary. I think America's political climate provides a critical lesson in the dangers of complacency. If we just sit back and we let things happen around us and we're not active participants in our own democratic processes and actively engaged citizens, then there is a real risk that we could see the erosion of democratic norms happening so incrementally that it's too late for us to do anything to change it. This should be a wake-up call to us as Australians and all around the world to remain vigilant and proactive. This means we need to work to strengthen our civic institutions. We need to support independent media. We need to advocate for policies that prioritise inclusion and human rights. And this is a big one for us as changemakers. Our social movements need to remain united. Authoritarianism, fascism, it thrives on division. The whole point of social change should be to promote diversity and inclusion. Both the left and the right do this horribly. Our social movements should aim to bring people together between and across the political spectrum. We need to advocate for policies that reflect shared values rather than just blind allegiance to a particular side of the political spectrum or a particular figure or a particular outcome. The question is not, I think, whether America is fascist, but whether the world, and that includes us here in Australia, is prepared to resist these tendencies because they are a real threat to our democracy. I think we need to address these challenges collectively and we need to remain vigilant. We, as changemakers, are the ones who are driving change, and we need to make sure that the work we do is going to be rooted in equity, justice, and democratic integrity. I know this was a big topic to address, and I'm sure it's going to ruffle a couple of feathers. I'm sure most of the people that get triggered by this episode are not even going to listen to more than a quarter of it, so it is what it is. But the work that we do at the Humanitarian Changemakers Network and all of the work that I do just personally across the social change space is not grounded in any political ideology. I do not see myself falling on either side of the political spectrum. A lot of the work that I do and a lot of the things that I advocate for might tend to be aligned with one side over the other, but I myself do not identify as being left or right. I believe that the thing that guides me morally and the work that I do are human rights and currently the Sustainable Development Goals. Whatever kind of global agenda for meaningful change and sustainable development comes after the SDGs, that will be what guides me. But all of the work that I do is grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and previously the MDGs, now the SDGs. I think that the beauty of these doctrine is that they're not left or right. Some people on the left or right might perceive them as being that way, but they're not. Just a little disclaimer, something that I wanted to add. If you have any questions about anything I've discussed in this episode, definitely ask them directly on YouTube if you're watching this video as a comment, or you can leave a comment on Spotify if you're listening on Spotify. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have in an upcoming episode.